even to myself, but I knew.
Mary told me. I remember I was upstairs. There's a window you could see outside with the sheriff coming up, talking to Mary, and I knew it was happening. She came upstairs and told me they found her body in the river.
This afternoon, searchers found a body in Whatcom County.
A body has been recovered from the South Fork of the Nooksack River.
The body of Mandy Stavik, whom everyone knew as Mandy.
There is a moment in every unsolved case, not the dramatic one, not the one that makes the headlines, but the quiet one. The one that looks from the outside like nothing at all. This is that moment. Spring, 2017, a bakery outlet store in Whatcom County, Washington. The kind of place that smells like warm bread and routine. Customers come in, pick up day-old loaves, exchange small talk, leave. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. Except today, a woman named Kim Wagner is watching. She has been watching for a while now. Not obsessively, not in a way that anyone around her would notice, but watching the way you watch someone when something about them has never quite sat right with you. When a name keeps surfacing in conversations it shouldn't, when a feeling you can't fully explain refuses to go away. The man she is watching picks up a plastic cup. He drinks from it, and then, without a second thought the way anyone would, he drops it in the trash. Kim Wagner walks over. Her heart is pounding. She reaches in. She takes the cup. She puts it in her desk drawer. That is it. That is the whole moment. No sirens, no confrontation, no dramatic reveal. Just a woman, a cup, and 28 years of silence about to end. What Kim Wagner did not know, what she could not have known, was that the answer to one of Whatcom County's most haunting cold cases had just passed through her hands. That the DNA on the rim of that cup would match a biological profile collected from a murdered girl's body in 1989. That the probability of a coincidental match would come back at 1 in 11 quadrillion. And that the man who had dropped that cup so casually, the man who had lived and worked and moved through this community for nearly 3 decades, was about to be arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Mandy Stavik. But to understand why that cup mattered, you have to go back. Back to a town that believed it was safe. Back to a girl who was less than a quarter mile from her front door. Back to the afternoon of November 24th, 1989. And the moment Acme, Washington lost something it would never fully get back. To understand Mandy Stavik, you first have to understand Acme. Acme, Washington is not the kind of place that appears on maps people actually use. It sits in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. We're tucked into Whatcom County in the far northwest corner of Washington state, close enough to the Canadian border that on a clear day the geography feels borderless. The Nooksack River runs through it. The roads are narrow. The trees are tall and dense and permanent. The population in 1989 was somewhere around 250 people. 250 people. That is not a town. That is a neighborhood. That is a place where you do not need to introduce yourself because everyone already knows your name, your parents' names, and which house you grew up in. That is a place built on the assumption that proximity equals safety, that knowing your neighbors means trusting them, that a short walk home is just a short walk home. It is the kind of place where a girl feels safe running alone. Amanda Lynn Stavik was 17 years old in the fall of 1989. Everyone called her Mandy. She was a senior at Mount Baker High School, and if you had asked anyone in Acme to describe her, they would have run out of breath before they ran out of things to say. She played 4 sports. She played 3 instruments. She was learning sign language. She was studying Japanese. She was a certified lifeguard. She was an honor student. She wanted to be a commercial pilot, not because someone told her she could, but because she had decided she would. Her coach, Jim Freeman, kept a card she had written him, not because it was unusual for a student to write a thank you card, but because of what it said. The specificity of her gratitude, the maturity of her voice, weigh the sense that even at 17 she understood the value of the people who invested in her. He kept it because it sounded like someone who was going to do something with her life. Her mother, Mary Stavik, would later say, she wanted to be the best at everything she did, and she was. That is not a grieving mother's exaggeration. That is a description that every person who knew Mandy Stavik has independently confirmed in interview after interview across nearly 3 decades of a case that refused to close. She was, by every account, extraordinary. Not in a distant, untouchable way, but in the way that makes people want to be around you. The kind of person who fills a room without trying to. And before we go any further, there is something else you need to know about the Stavik family. Something that makes what happened to Mandy not just a tragedy, but a second one. Mary Stavik had already buried a child to violence. Mandy's older brother, Brent Stavik, had been murdered in Alaska in 1975, 14 years before Mandy disappeared. His case was never solved. His killer was never identified. Mary had already lived through the particular, unending devastation of losing a child to a crime that gave her no answers, no justice, no closure. Just an open wound that time does not heal. It only learns to carry. She was carrying it still on the morning of November 24th, 1989, when her family sat down together for Thanksgiving. Mandy was there, laughing, present, and alive in the way that only people who are fully engaged with their own lives can be. She had come home from Washington State University, where she was a freshman, for the holiday break. She was home with her mother, her brother Lee, her sister Molly. The house was warm. The family was together. It was the last time they would be. By the following afternoon, Mandy Stavik would be gone, and the town of 250 people that had always believed that knowing your neighbors meant being safe would learn in the most devastating way possible that the danger had been living among them all along. Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 1989. The meal was done. The family was settled. And Mandy Stavik, the way she always did, wanted to move. She was a runner, not casually, seriously. The kind of athlete who does not take holidays off, who feels the restlessness of a sedentary afternoon in her body before she feels it in her mind. So sometime in the early afternoon, she laced up her shoes, called her dog, a large dog, a dog that by any reasonable measure should have been a deterrent, and she headed out the door for a run along Acme Road, less than a quarter mile from her front door. That detail matters. It is not incidental. It is the detail that every person who knew Mandy Stavik has returned to, again and again, across 35 years of grief and questions and sleepless nights. Less than a quarter mile, not a remote trail, not an isolated stretch of highway, a road she had run dozens of times, a road her family could practically see from their window, or a road in a town of 250 people where everyone knew her name. She never came home. By evening, when the light had gone and the temperature had dropped and Mandy had not returned, her family began to worry. The dog came back without her. That single fact, the dog returning alone, was the first signal that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Dogs do not leave their people, not without reason, not without something happening first. The search began that night. Neighbors came out, family searched. The community that had always prided itself on looking out for its own mobilized immediately. Because in a town of 250 people, a missing girl is not an abstract concern. It is personal. It is someone's daughter. It is someone you sat next to at the school play, someone whose mother you see at the grocery store, someone whose face you know. They searched through the night. They searched the next day. And on November 26, 1989, 2 days after she had left for her run, Mandy Stavik's body was found. She was in the Nooksack River, not far from where she had been running. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been murdered. She was 17 years old. The autopsy would confirm what the discovery had already made devastatingly clear. This was not an accident. This was not a fall. This was a deliberate act of violence committed against a girl who had done nothing more than go for a run on a holiday afternoon in the town where she had grown up, on a road she had run 100 times before, less than a quarter mile from her front door. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office opened a homicide investigation immediately. They had a crime scene. They had physical evidence. They had a community in shock, willing to cooperate, desperate for answers. They had everything that, on paper, should have led to a swift resolution. What they did not have, what they would not have for 28 years, was a name. The investigation was about to begin, and so, without anyone knowing it yet, was one of the longest waits for justice in Whatcom County history. A wait measured not in months, not in years, but in decades. In birthdays Mandy never had. In a mother who buried her daughter and kept going. In a community that never forgot. And a killer who believed, for 28 years, that forgetting was exactly what would happen. He was wrong. But it would take a very long time to prove it. When a body is recovered from water, the investigation changes. Not in its urgency, that remains absolute, but in its complexity. Water is not a passive element in a crime. It moves, it carries, it erases, it redistributes evidence in ways that can take weeks to fully understand, and in some cases in ways that can never be fully undone. A river specifically is one of the most challenging environments a forensic investigator can work in, because a river does not preserve, it processes. It takes what is placed in it and it moves it downstream, dilutes it, submerges it, and over time, dismantles it. The Nooksack River gave Mandy Stavik back, but it did not give back everything. What investigators did recover was significant. Physical evidence was collected. A biological profile, DNA, was extracted from Mandy's body. In 1989, DNA technology was in its earliest operational stages. The FBI had only just begun using DNA analysis in criminal investigations. The science existed, but the infrastructure, the databases, the comparison tools, the genealogical mapping capabilities that would eventually crack this case, did not yet. What investigators had was a profile with no match, an answer with no name attached to it. Ron Peterson was the Whatcom County detective assigned to the case. His name is not one that appears in headlines, but it belongs in this story, because Ron Peterson did not let this case go cold quietly. He worked it. He followed leads. He conducted interviews. He submitted evidence. He kept the file active in a way that many cases, after the initial investigation stalls, simply are not. Peterson interviewed people in the community. He looked at individuals whose behavior, whose proximity to Mandy, whose history raised questions. He developed persons of interest. And at some point in the early stages of the investigation, a name came up. Timothy Bass. Bass was a neighbor. He lived close to the Stavik family. Close enough that his proximity to the route Mandy ran that afternoon was not coincidental. It was geographic. He was known in the community. He was not a stranger. He was exactly the kind of person that a town of 250 people would know by name, by face, by the car he drove, and the hours he kept. Peterson looked at him. The investigation looked at him. And Bass, when approached, denied any involvement. Without physical evidence connecting him directly, without a DNA match, without a witness, or without the forensic tools that did not yet exist in their current form, the investigation could not move forward on Bass alone. There were other persons of interest. There were other leads. The case was wide, and the evidence, while present, was not yet pointing with the precision that a prosecution requires. And so the years began to pass, not because investigators stopped caring, not because the community forgot, but because the gap between knowing something in your gut and proving it in a court of law is one of the most frustrating distances in criminal justice. And in 1989, 1990, 1991, that gap was wider than it would ever be again. Ron Peterson retired. The case passed to other hands. The file remained open. Mandy Stavik's DNA profile sat in evidence, waiting. She patient in the way that science is patient, indifferent to the passage of time in the way that biology is indifferent, waiting for the moment when the tools would catch up to the truth. That moment was still a long way off, but it was coming. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an unsolved case. It is not the silence of indifference. It is not the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of exhaustion, of leads that went nowhere, of interviews that produced nothing actionable, of evidence that existed but could not yet speak the language investigators needed it to speak. It is the silence of a case that has not been forgotten, but has run out of forward momentum. That is where the Mandy Stavik investigation found itself through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The file stayed open. That matters. In many jurisdictions, cases like this one, cases where the initial investigation produced physical evidence but no arrest, where persons of interest were identified but not charged, where the community was cooperative, but the answers remained just out of reach, quietly migrate to the back of the cabinet. Not officially closed, just no longer actively worked. The difference between an open case and an active case is one of the most important and least discussed distinctions in cold case investigation. The Mandy Stavik case remained open, but for stretches of time, it was not active in the way it needed to be. Meanwhile, the world around it was changing. DNA technology was advancing at a pace that no one in 1989 could have fully anticipated. Or the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, was established by the FBI in 1998, creating a national database that allowed DNA profiles from crime scenes to be compared against profiles from convicted offenders. It was a revolution in cold case investigation. Cases that had sat dormant for decades suddenly had a mechanism, a way for the evidence to reach out across time and find a match. The Mandy Stavik case profile was entered into CODIS. It did not return a match. That result, or rather that absence of a result, tells its own story. Timothy Bass, the neighbor who had been looked at in the early stages of the investigation, had no prior felony convictions that would have placed his DNA in the federal database. He had moved through life without accumulating the kind of criminal record that would have flagged him. When he was not invisible to the system, he simply had not given the system a reason to look at him closely enough to collect his DNA. And so the database searched, and the database came back empty, and the case continued to sit. Mary Stavik did not sit. Through the 90s, through the 2000s, through every year that passed without an answer, Mandy's mother remained a presence in this case. She spoke to investigators. She kept Mandy's memory alive in the way that only a mother can. Not as a cause, not as a campaign, but as a refusal to allow her daughter to become a statistic, a refusal to allow the silence to become permanent, a refusal, quiet and absolute, to stop asking the question that no one had yet been able to answer. Who did this to my daughter? It is worth pausing here to sit with what that kind of waiting costs a person. Mary Stavik had already lost one child to unsolved violence. Her son Brent, murdered in Alaska in 1975, a case that remains open to this day. She was now living through it a second time. The same absence of answers, the same open wound, the same morning after morning of waking up and carrying something that does not get lighter, only more familiar. She kept going, because what else do you do? The case kept waiting, because the science was not finished yet. At some point in the mid-2000s, something shifted. It was not a single event. It was not a new witness coming forward, or a deathbed confession, or a piece of evidence that had been overlooked suddenly being found. It was something quieter than that. And in many ways, and more powerful. It was the accumulation of technology, institutional will, and the particular kind of determination that cold case investigators develop when they have been living with a file long enough to take it personally. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office reopened the Mandy Stavik case as an active investigation. This distinction between open and active cannot be overstated. An active investigation means resources. It means assigned personnel. It means the case is not waiting for something to happen to it, but is being worked toward a resolution. It means someone is sitting down with the file, reading every interview, re-examining every piece of evidence, and asking the question that fresh eyes always ask: what did we miss? And what can we do now that we could not do then? What they could do now that they could not do then was considerable. DNA technology had not just advanced, it had transformed. The ability to extract, preserve, and compare biological profiles had become exponentially more sophisticated. Genealogical DNA databases, platforms like GED Match, where individuals voluntarily upload their genetic profiles to find relatives, had opened an entirely new avenue of investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country were beginning to use investigative genetic genealogy, the process of taking an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene, uploading it to a genealogical database, identifying distant relatives, and then building a family tree forward in time to identify a potential suspect. It was the technique that had cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018. It was the technique that was quietly revolutionizing cold case investigation across the United States. But before genealogy, investigators tried something more direct. They conducted a DNA sweep. A DNA sweep, sometimes called a DNA dragnet, is exactly what it sounds like. Investigators identify a pool of individuals who, based on geography, timeline, and investigative history, cannot be ruled out as potential suspects. They then approach those individuals and request a voluntary DNA sample. The request is voluntary. No one is compelled to provide a sample, but the act of refusing, or the act of agreeing, tells its own story. Timothy Bass was included in the sweep. He was asked to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. He refused. That refusal did not constitute evidence of guilt. Legally, it could not be used against him in court. A person has every right to decline a voluntary DNA request, and that right is protected. But investigatively, in the context of a man who had been a person of interest since the earliest days of the investigation, who lived in close proximity to the route Mandy ran, who had been looked at and never cleared, that refusal was significant. It narrowed the focus. Investigators now had a man who had been in the community in 1989, who lived near the crime scene, who had been a person of interest for decades, and who had now explicitly declined to provide the one piece of biological evidence that could either clear him or connect him to Mandy Stavik's murder. They could not compel him. They could not arrest him. They did not yet have what they needed, but they knew where to look. The question was no longer whether Timothy Bass was connected to this case. The question, the operational, investigative, legally consequential question, was how to obtain his DNA without his cooperation. The answer was already out there, living her life, watching, waiting for the right moment. Her name was Kim Wagner, awaiting your approval to move to Section 7. Two mothers at a water park. Kim Wagner knew Timothy Bass the way people in small communities know each other, not intimately, not as a close friend or a confidant, but as a presence, a familiar face in a shared geography, someone whose name you know and whose car you recognize, and whose general existence registers in the background of your daily life without ever demanding your full attention. But Kim Wagner had been paying attention. She had known Mandy Stavik. Not deeply, not in the way of best friends or daily companions, but in the way of a small community where everyone's lives overlap at the edges. She knew who Mandy was. She knew what had happened to her. And she knew, in the way that people who live close to a crime sometimes know things that are difficult to articulate and impossible to prove, that something about Timothy Bass had never sat right with her. It was not one thing. It was the accumulation of small things. The kind of unease that does not announce itself loudly but settles into the back of your mind and stays there, quiet and persistent, for years. And then came the moment that changed everything. The details of exactly how Kim Wagner came to be at a water park with Timothy Bass and his family have been reported with slight variations across different accounts of this case. What is consistent, what is confirmed, is this. At some point, Kim Wagner found herself in a social situation with Bass, close enough to observe him, close enough to watch him interact with his family, with the world around him, with the ordinary rhythms of a life lived as though nothing had ever happened. She watched him, and something in that watching, something in the proximity, in the ordinariness of it, in the sight of a man she had long suspected moving through the world with complete ease, crystallized a decision that had perhaps been forming for years without her fully knowing it. She was going to do something. She did not know exactly what yet. She did not have a plan in the formal sense. What she had was a conviction, quiet, absolute, and entirely her own, that if there was any chance she could help bring justice for Mandy Stavik, she was going to take it. It is worth pausing here to consider what Kim Wagner was carrying in that moment. She was not a detective. She was not a forensic scientist. She was not operating with the authority of a badge or the protection of an institution. She was a woman in a community that had been living with an unsolved murder for nearly 3 decades, watching a man she suspected go about his life and making a private decision to act. That decision would later raise legal questions, important ones, questions that would be argued in court and that we will examine closely in this episode. But in the human terms of that moment, what Kim Wagner did was something that is very difficult to judge from the outside. She saw a gap. She saw something that investigators, bound by legal constraints, could not do, and she decided to step into it. She began to watch Bass more deliberately. She noted where he went. She noted his routines. She noted the places where their paths crossed, and she began to think about what those crossings might make possible. The water park moment was not the moment she acted. It was the moment she decided she would. The moment she acted came later, in a bakery outlet store, on an ordinary day, when a man picked up a plastic cup, drank from it, and dropped it in the trash without a second thought. Kim Wagner was already there. She had been waiting to understand why Timothy Bass was never arrested in the years immediately following Mandy Stavik's murder. You have to understand who he was, and more precisely, who he appeared to be. Bass lived on Strand Road in Acme, a road that, if you trace it on a map, sits in uncomfortable proximity to the route Mandy ran on the afternoon of November 24th, 1989. Not distant, not coincidental, close, in the way that geography, in a case like this one, becomes one of the first things investigators look at, and one of the last things they can prove means anything on its own. He was 22 years old when Mandy Stavik was murdered. He was not a drifter. He was not a transient. He was not someone who had blown through Acme and disappeared before investigators could find him. He was a resident, a neighbor, a young man embedded in the same small community fabric that made Acme the kind of place where people felt safe, where a girl could go for a run on Thanksgiving afternoon and her family would not think twice about it. That embeddedness was, in a deeply uncomfortable way, his protection. Because in a community of 250 people, everyone has an alibi of sorts. Not a formal one, and not a documented one, but the alibi of familiarity, the alibi of being known, the alibi of being the person people have always seen around, always recognized, always categorized as part of the landscape rather than a threat within it. Bass had that. He also had something else, something that would become more significant as the years passed and the investigation continued to circle back to him. He had the ability to present normally, to hold a job, to maintain relationships, to exist within the structures of daily life without drawing the kind of attention that might have accelerated the investigation's focus on him. Behavioral analysts who study cases of this type, cases involving what criminologists classify as acquaintance homicide, where the perpetrator is known to the victim or the victim's community, consistently note a particular profile. The individual is often not the person anyone would immediately identify as dangerous. They are frequently described in the aftermath of an arrest with the language of disbelief. He seemed normal. He was always around. I never would have thought. That language would eventually be applied to Timothy Bass. But in the years between 1989 and the mid-2000s, Bass continued to live in the area. He continued to be present. He continued to be, in the eyes of the community, a familiar face rather than a confirmed threat. Investigators had not forgotten him. Ron Peterson had looked at him early. Subsequent investigators had returned to him. His name was in the file. His proximity was documented. His refusal to provide a voluntary DNA sample when the sweep was conducted had been noted. But noted is not the same as actionable. The law requires more than proximity, more than suspicion, more than a refusal. It requires evidence, specific, physical, legally obtained evidence that can be presented to a jury and withstand the scrutiny of a defense attorney and the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. Timothy Bass had not given investigators that evidence. He had lived on Strand Road. He had stayed in the community. He had watched the years pass. And if he believed, as he must have on some level, to have continued living as he did, that time was on his side, that the case would eventually exhaust itself, that the silence would eventually become permanent. He had miscalculated. Why? Because the woman who would undo him was not a detective. She was not a scientist. She was not operating from a government office with a warrant and a badge. She was someone who worked at a bakery outlet store, and she had already decided. Spring 2017. Kim Wagner had been watching Timothy Bass for a long time by now. Not every day, not in a way that consumed her life or defined her waking hours, but watching the way a person watches when they have made a private decision and are waiting for the right moment to act on it. The moment arrived without announcement. Bass came into the bakery outlet store where Kim Wagner worked. This was not unusual. He was a regular presence in the community. His appearance that day was unremarkable, the kind of ordinary errand that fills an ordinary day. He picked up a plastic cup. He drank from it. And then, with the casual indifference of a man who had no reason to think anyone was paying particular attention to him, he dropped it in the trash. Kim Wagner waited. She watched him leave, and then she walked to the trash can, reached in, and took the cup. She put it in her desk drawer. That is the whole action. Described in its bare mechanics, it is almost absurdly simple. A woman retrieving a discarded cup from a trash can. No technology, no warrant, no institutional authority. Just a decision, a moment in a piece of plastic that a man had touched with his hands in his mouth and then thrown away without a second thought. What Kim Wagner understood, intuitively, and without a law degree or a forensics background, was something that the legal system has spent considerable energy debating in the years since. When a person discards an object, they surrender a certain expectation of privacy over it. The DNA on that cup, the biological material left on its rim, was in the legal framework that would eventually govern this case, abandoned property. Bass had thrown it away. He had relinquished it. He had, in the eyes of the law, given up any reasonable expectation that it remained his. Kim Wagner took it to investigators. She handed over the cup and explained what she had done and why. She told them about her suspicions. She told them about the years of watching. She told them about the water park, or about the accumulation of unease that had never resolved itself into certainty but had never gone away either. Investigators took the cup. They submitted it for DNA analysis, and then they waited. The way investigators wait when they have done everything they can do, and the answer is now in the hands of the science. The particular suspended quality of that waiting, the knowledge that the result will either confirm everything or collapse it, that there is no middle ground, that the cup either matches or it does not. It matched. The DNA extracted from the rim of that plastic cup, the biological material left behind by a man who had dropped it in a trash can without a second thought, matched the DNA profile that had been collected from Mandy Stavik's body in 1989. The probability of a coincidental match, 1 in 11 quadrillion. To put that number in human terms, 11 quadrillion is 11 followed by 15 zeros. It is a number so large that it functionally eliminates the concept of coincidence. It does not suggest Timothy Bass was connected to Mandy Stavik's murder. It does not indicate or imply or point toward. It establishes. With a certainty that the language of probability can barely contain, it establishes that the biological material on that cup and the biological material recovered from Mandy Stavik's body came from the same person. 28 years of silence, one discarded cup, one woman who had been watching and waiting and refusing, in her own quiet way, to let this go. The arrest of Timothy Bass was now not a matter of if, it was a matter of hours. On November 8, 2017, Timothy Bass was arrested. 28 years, 11 months, and 15 days after Mandy Stavik left her house for a run on Thanksgiving afternoon and never came home, a man was finally in handcuffs. A name was finally attached to the DNA profile that had been sitting in evidence since 1989. A case that had outlasted careers, outlasted technology, outlasted the reasonable expectations of everyone who had worked it and everyone who had waited, had broken open. The arrest did not happen quietly. In a community of 250 people, nothing happens quietly. But this was the kind of news that moves through a small town like a physical force. The kind of news that stops people mid-sentence, that makes them sit down, that produces simultaneously in the relief of an answer and the grief of confirmation. Because as long as a case is unsolved, there is a part of the human mind that holds open the possibility, however irrational, that the worst did not happen the way you feared it did. An arrest closes that door permanently. Timothy Bass was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. He was 50 years old. He had lived in the community, or close to it, for nearly 3 decades after the murder. He had watched the investigation circle around him. He had refused the voluntary DNA request. He had continued to exist within the ordinary structures of daily life, working, moving, aging, while Mandy Stavik's family carried the weight of an unanswered question that he alone could have answered at any point in those 28 years. He had chosen silence, and now the science had spoken for him. It is worth pausing here to examine what the number 1 in 11 quadrillion actually means, not just as a statistic, but as a statement about the nature of evidence. DNA probability statistics are expressed as the likelihood that a randomly selected individual from the general population would share the same genetic profile as the sample being tested. 1 in 11 quadrillion means that if you lined up every human being who has ever lived on this planet, every person across the entirety of recorded human history, estimated at approximately 108 billion people, and tested every single one of them, the probability of finding a coincidental match to the DNA on that cup would still be vanishingly, almost incomprehensibly small. This is not circumstantial evidence. This is not a witness with a faulty memory or a motive to lie. This is biology. This is the language of the body itself, specific, immutable, indifferent to the passage of time and the preferences of the person it belongs to. Timothy Bass's DNA had been on Mandy Stavik's body for 28 years. It had waited. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest moved with the particular deliberate pace of a serious felony case. Defense attorneys examined the evidence. The question of Kim Wagner's cup, how it was obtained, whether it constituted an illegal search, whether the DNA extracted from it was admissible, was argued. The court ruled that because Bass had discarded the cup, he had no reasonable expectation of privacy over it. The DNA was admissible. That ruling was significant, not just for this case, but for the broader legal framework governing civilian evidence collection, a framework that is still being defined and debated as cases involving abandoned DNA continue to work their way through the courts. But for the purposes of this case, the ruling meant one thing above all else: the evidence would stand. Timothy Bass would face a jury, and Mandy Stavik, 17 years old, 4 sports, 3 instruments, a girl who wanted to be a pilot and had every reason to believe she would finally have her day in court. The trial of Timothy Bass began in Whatcom County in 2019, 30 years after Mandy Stavik's body was recovered from the Nooksack River. 30 years after her family had sat in the wreckage of a Thanksgiving holiday that had become something no family should ever have to survive. 30 years after Ron Peterson had opened a file and begun asking questions that would take 3 decades to answer. The courtroom was, in many ways, the culmination of everything. Every interview, every evidence submission, every DNA comparison, every year of waiting, every decision made by every person who had refused to let this case go cold permanently. It was the place where the science, the investigation, and the law were required to come together and produce something that the preceding 30 years had not been able to produce: a verdict. The prosecution's case was built on the DNA evidence, the match between the profile extracted from Mandy Stavik's body in 1989 and the profile obtained from the cup Kim Wagner had retrieved from the trash in 2017. 1 in 11 quadrillion. That number was placed before the jury with the full weight of its meaning, not as a suggestion, not as a possibility, as a biological fact. The prosecution also presented the geographic evidence: Bass's proximity to the route Mandy ran, his residence on Strand Road, the physical relationship between where he lived and where she was last seen alive. They presented the investigative history, the early identification of Bass as a person of interest, his refusal to provide a voluntary DNA sample during the sweep, the decades of circumstantial indicators that had pointed in his direction without ever being sufficient on their own to bring charges. The defense challenged the DNA collection method. This was the central legal battleground of the trial, not whether the DNA matched, because the science on that point was unassailable, But whether the manner in which it was obtained was legally permissible, the defense argued that Kim Wagner's retrieval of the cup constituted an unlawful search, that her close relationship with law enforcement, her deliberate targeting of Bass, and her act of collecting his DNA and turning it over to investigators made her, in legal terms, an agent of the state rather than a private citizen acting independently. If that argument had succeeded, if the court had determined that Wagner was functioning as a state agent, the DNA evidence would have been subject to Fourth Amendment protections, and its admissibility would have been in serious jeopardy. The court rejected the argument. The ruling held that Kim Wagner was a private citizen acting on her own initiative. She had not been directed by law enforcement to collect the cup. She had not been operating under their instruction or authority. She had made an independent decision based on her own suspicions and her own conscience, and had then turned the evidence over to investigators. The DNA was admissible. With that ruling, the defense's primary avenue of attack was closed. The jury deliberated, and on a day in 2019, 30 years after a 17-year-old girl went for a run on Thanksgiving afternoon and never came home, the jury returned a verdict: guilty. Timothy Bass was convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree rape. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Mandy Stavik heard the verdict. The woman who had already buried one child to unsolved violence. The woman who had spent 30 years asking a question that no one could answer. The woman who had kept going, not because it was easy, not because the waiting had not cost her enormously, but because she had refused with everything she had to stop. She heard the word guilty, and 30 years of waiting finally had somewhere to go. Timothy Bass is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at a Washington State correctional facility. He has not spoken publicly about the case. He has not offered an explanation, an apology, or an acknowledgement of what he did on the afternoon of November 24, 1989. He has maintained, in the way that some convicted killers maintain, a silence that is its own kind of statement, a continuation in prison of the same silence he maintained for 30 years in the community where he committed his crime. He is in his mid-50s now, and Mandy Stavik would have been in her early 50s too. That parallel, the life he has lived, however diminished, against the life she never got to live, is one of the quiet devastations of cases like this one. The perpetrator ages. The victim does not. The perpetrator accumulates years. Even years behind bars are years, are mornings and evenings and seasons changing, while the victim remains permanently fixed at the age they were when their life was taken. Mandy Stavik is forever 17. Timothy Bass is not. That asymmetry does not resolve with a conviction. It simply becomes something the people who loved her learned to carry alongside the relief of justice. Mandy Stavik was laid to rest in Acme, Washington. Her grave exists in the community where she grew up, where she ran, where she was known and loved and remembered. The town of 250 people that lost something irreplaceable on a Thanksgiving afternoon in 1989 has never forgotten her. Her name has not faded. Her story has not been absorbed into the anonymous archive of cold cases that never found resolution. It has remained specific and personal and present, the way the memory of someone extraordinary tends to remain. Mandy Stavik spoke after the verdict. Her words, reported across multiple accounts of this case, carried the particular weight of a woman who had waited 30 years for the right to say them. She spoke about Mandy, about who she was, about what she had lost, about the decades of carrying an unanswered question while continuing to live and breathe and function in a world that had taken both of her children to violence. She said that she hoped Mandy could finally rest. Kim Wagner also spoke. The woman who had watched and waited and reached into a trash can and changed the course of this case, spoke about what had driven her, about the years of unease that had never resolved, about the moment in the bakery outlet store when she had made a decision that she knew on some level could not be undone, about what it meant to her that the evidence had held, that the court had ruled in its favor, that the cup had done what she had hoped it would do when she put it in her desk drawer. She said she did it for Mandy. There is one thread in this case that remains open. Brent Stavik, Mandy's older brother, murdered in Alaska in 1975, has never had his case resolved. His killer has never been identified. His file remains open in the same way Mandy's file remained open for 30 years. Not forgotten, but unanswered. Mary Stavik has now seen one of her children receive justice. The other is still waiting. That open thread is not a footnote. It is a reminder that justice, when it comes, does not always come completely. That a family can receive an answer to one devastating question and still be living with another. That the work of cold case investigation is never fully finished as long as there are cases that remain unsolved and families that remain without resolution. Brent Stavik deserves the same answer his sister finally received. His case remains open. There is a question that sits underneath every cold case story, underneath the timelines and the evidence, and the courtroom rulings and the verdicts. A question that the facts alone cannot fully answer. A question that belongs not to the investigation, but to the human beings who lived inside it. What does justice actually cost? Not in the legal sense, not in the procedural sense of what it takes to build a case and win a conviction, but in the human sense, in the sense of what it extracts from the people who spend years, sometimes decades, pursuing it. What it costs Mary Stavik to have waited 30 years. What it costs a community to have lived alongside a killer without knowing it. What it costs a girl like Mandy Stavik, not in the abstract, but specifically, concretely, to have her life reduced in the public record to the circumstances of her death rather than the fullness of her living. This case asks all of those questions simultaneously, and it asks one more. What do we owe the people who act when institutions cannot? Kim Wagner was not a detective. She had no authority, no badge, no institutional protection. She was a woman in a small community who had been carrying a suspicion for years and who, when the moment presented itself, made a decision that no one had asked her to make and no one could have compelled her to make. She acted alone. She acted on conscience, and she acted in a legal gray area that the courts have since examined and ruled on, but that remains in the broader landscape of criminal justice, an area of genuine complexity. The legal question of when a private citizen becomes a state agent, when civilian evidence collection crosses the line from independent action into an extension of law enforcement, is not settled. And it is being actively litigated in cases across the country. The ruling in the Bass case established a precedent within its jurisdiction, but the national conversation about abandoned DNA, civilian surveillance, and the boundaries of the Fourth Amendment is ongoing. That complexity matters. It matters because the same legal framework that allowed Kim Wagner's cup to be admitted as evidence could, in a different case, with different facts, produce a different outcome. The law does not make exceptions for good intentions. It makes rulings based on facts and precedent, and the facts of each case determine whether the evidence stands or falls. In this case, it stood. But the broader question of what we want the relationship between civilian action and law enforcement to look like, one of how much we are comfortable with private citizens filling the gaps that legal constraints create, is a question that this case raises without fully answering. It is a question worth sitting with. And then there is Mandy herself, 17 years old, 4 sports, 3 instruments, sign language, Japanese, a lifeguard certification, an ambition to fly, a thank you card that her coach kept for decades because it sounded like someone who was going to do something with her life. She was going to do something with her life. That is the thing that a case like this one, with its DNA breakthroughs and its legal arguments and its 30-year timeline, can sometimes obscure. The science is remarkable. The investigation is compelling. The legal questions are genuinely important. But underneath all of it is a girl who went for a run on Thanksgiving afternoon and deserved to come home. She deserved to become the pilot she planned to be. She deserved to use the Japanese she was learning and the sign language she was studying. She deserved to grow up and grow old and become whatever extraordinary version of herself she was already becoming at 17. She did not get that. What she got 30 years late was the truth. It is not enough. It is never enough. But it is something, and in the long, costly, imperfect work of justice, something is what we fight for. Rest, Mandy.